I saved lives every day as a trauma surgeon, and had no idea the woman I loved was using me to steal one of her own. She faked our marriage, drained my bank account, and planned to disappear with another man. But she made one mistake. She underestimated the man she thought was too busy to notice. The late afternoon light bathed the quiet streets of Redwood Hills in amber tones as Caleb Strickland pulled his car into the gravel driveway of his modest suburban home. His body ached with exhaustion after 36 relentless hours at the trauma ward, but the familiar ache was dulled by the simple comfort of the word home. His mind wandered toward dinner, perhaps takeout, maybe something light, followed by a quiet evening with Lilith, a woman he once believed to be his anchor. He grabbed his duffel from the passenger seat and headed toward the front door, the kind of quiet anticipation that comes after chaos settling in his chest. Lilith's car was parked outside, and the windows glowed faintly, yet something felt off. The house, usually filled with low music or the scent of candles, was silent. Caleb stepped inside, the soft sound of the lock turning behind him unnervingly loud. He placed his bag down and moved through the hallway, preparing to call her name. Then he heard it. Laughter, hers, layered with others. Faint voices floated from the study, casual and unguarded. He approached the partially open door, his instincts on edge. What he heard next shifted the world beneath him. Lilith's voice drifted through the doorway, confident and smug, describing their marriage as a transaction, her true partner waiting in the wings. The words came with cruel clarity. He was a means to an end, a name on a visa application, nothing more. She spoke of her manipulation, the ease of his trust, her plans already in motion. Each word gutted him like a scalpel. He stood frozen, heart pounding, jaw tight, as fragments of his life rearranged into something unrecognizable. 3 years of shared routines, laughter, and whispered futures, now reduced to a calculated performance. Without making a sound, he stepped away. There was no confrontation, no shouting. Not yet. His control remained intact, thin as glass. Inside the quiet of his home office, Caleb sat in the shadows, staring at nothing. Time slipped by in uneven intervals. Eventually, he picked up his phone and made a call. Jude Merrick arrived less than 30 minutes later. They spoke quietly in the kitchen, the house still cloaked in manufactured peace. Caleb laid out the truth, each detail revealing the scale of the betrayal. Jude didn't interrupt. He just listened, his face darkening with understanding. Together, they began to trace the pattern, the inconsistencies in her stories, the financial secrecy, the convenient disappearances. Caleb's instincts told him this wasn't Lilith's first deception. There was something practiced about her smile. Jude mentioned someone who could help, a legal expert who dealt with immigration fraud. Caleb agreed without hesitation. It wasn't revenge he was after. It was justice and prevention. Whatever Lilith and her so-called partner had done to him, they wouldn't do to anyone else. Later that night, Lilith moved through the kitchen with performative warmth, preparing dinner like any ordinary evening. Caleb sat across from her, mask firmly in place, watching her every move. Her gestures, once familiar, now felt staged, her voice too bright, her eyes avoiding his. He ate in silence, swallowed bitterness with each bite, and kept his expression neutral. Nothing would be revealed tonight, no cracks in the mask. When dinner was over, he retreated upstairs. The following day would begin the quiet war. A war she wouldn't know she was part of, until it was far too late. The next morning, Caleb Strickland left home before sunrise. His steps were measured, his movements deliberate. He made sure to leave his laptop open on the kitchen counter. A carefully crafted email left on the screen. A decoy about a surprise gathering in Lilith's honor. It was bait, perfectly wrapped in the illusion of affection. He didn't look back as he stepped into his car. Lilith, still half asleep, emerged into the kitchen minutes later. The glow of the laptop caught her eye. She lingered longer than necessary. Curiosity piqued. Caleb knew her patterns, her impulse to dig into anything not meant for her. She would read it and she would believe it. That was the point. His destination wasn't the hospital. Instead, He drove to a discreet office complex on the city's edge. One door bore the name of a man who had made a career digging through the dirt others tried to bury. Knox Halden. The private investigator welcomed Caleb with the detached professionalism of someone who had seen too much. There were no questions about emotion, no small talk. Caleb explained the situation in clipped, clear detail. A spouse exploiting marriage for immigration, financial manipulation, a suspected partner in fraud. He didn't soften the facts. Knox listened and nodded slowly, then outlined the next steps. Bank records, phone logs, travel histories. Nothing would be left untouched. It would take time. It would cost. Caleb didn't flinch. He wanted truth and he wanted a trail. Back home, Lilith lounged with a glass of wine, the decoy email now tucked away in her thoughts. The text she sent to her lover was casual, a green light, an open door. Caleb had seen it all from his office, the hidden camera system streaming quietly to his phone. Every movement, every word was captured. Adrian Vega arrived like a shadow slipping through the cracks. Confident, entitled, familiar. He moved through the house as though he owned it. The two of them laughed, poured drinks, settled into the life they believed was theirs. They spoke without caution, without restraint. Caleb watched every frame. From the comfort of his dim hospital office later that evening, Caleb recorded the footage, catalogued each exchange. There was no sense of victory, only grim necessity. The betrayal, once a wound, had become something clinical, a problem to be dissected and treated. The days that followed blurred into a steady rhythm. Caleb continued his shifts at the trauma ward, his hands steady, his mind focused. His nights were consumed by files, by whispers of Lilith's past that Knox was beginning to uncover. There were connections in other cities, similar stories, names that matched with silence and vanishing records. Jude and Vera joined him one evening at the edge of town, in a cafe too obscure to attract attention. Together, they laid out the growing map of deceit. The evidence was damning, but it was also elegant. Financial transfers, matching travel dates, overlapping aliases. They weren't looking at a one-time manipulation. This was a method. And Lilith wasn't improvising. She was experienced. Caleb spoke little. He didn't need to. His eyes told the story, focused, cold, resolute. The mask of the betrayed man had been replaced by something sharper. He no longer needed to ask why. He needed to end it. A meeting with Harlan Devereux was arranged by Vera. The attorney's reputation preceded him. Relentless, precise, and fond of cases that tested his skill. Caleb handed over a flash drive containing everything. The recordings, the financial evidence, a full report from Knox. Harlan reviewed it in silence, his expression unreadable. When he spoke, his voice was even. The case was clear. There was more than enough to move forward with annulment and criminal investigation. Immigration fraud, financial misconduct, identity abuse, it was all there. Caleb agreed to every step. Not out of revenge. Out of necessity. Lilith Marin and Adrian Vega had done this before. He would ensure they wouldn't do it again. The final move began to form. A false sense of security would be their downfall. A carefully staged evening, timed to perfection. But for now, Caleb returned to his role as if nothing had changed. He wore the mask, delivered kindness, feigned exhaustion. Lilith watched him without suspicion. That was her mistake. Soon the act would be over, and no one would applaud when the curtain fell. The day of reckoning unfolded without urgency. Caleb Strickland had orchestrated each step with the patience of a surgeon. No incision made until the anatomy had been studied. No action taken until all instruments were in place. Lilith Marin believed herself the star of the evening. She stood before the full-length mirror, adjusting her crimson dress with care, her movements laced with confidence. Her hair fell in deliberate waves, her lips colored like promise. Caleb's text had been brief, inviting her to clear her schedule for a surprise. That was enough to ignite her imagination. There were no doubts in her mind. Caleb was devoted, blind, predictable. Downstairs, the house waited in silence. She descended, expecting warmth, light, applause. But the entryway greeted her with a different kind of spotlight. A man in a dark suit stood at the door. His presence wasn't charming. It was final. He identified himself as an agent from Immigration and Customs Enforcement. His voice carried no emotion. Lilith's name was spoken like a sentence. She tried to retreat. Another figure stepped into view. Caleb. His face, once a place of softness and trust, was now carved from something colder. He didn't speak with anger. He didn't raise his voice. He only watched. What followed was methodical. Paperwork was served. Handcuffs clicked. Her protests were quiet at first. Confusion, denial, then panic. But there was no reversal. Not now. Outside, a van waited. She scanned the street for a familiar car, for the one person who might pull her out of this. Adrian Vega had always promised to fix things, but he was absent. For now, across town, that absence broke. Adrian received her frantic message and reacted with the instinct of a man who had survived by improvisation. He jumped behind the wheel, weaving through traffic with calculated urgency. His thoughts weren't of guilt, they were of damage control. But Caleb had predicted every reaction. By the time Adrian reached the house, ICE agents had already positioned themselves. The second trap was sprung the moment he crossed the threshold. He wasn't subtle. He never had been. His voice boomed as he demanded explanations. His fists clenched, his body ready for confrontation. But the silence of the room didn't bend. Caleb stood again, watching. There was no triumph in his posture, only finality. The agents moved in. Adrian fought, not with fists, but with desperation. He threw out threats, appeals, lies. None of it landed. He and Lilith were removed separately. Neither spoke as they were placed into government vehicles. Their confidence had fractured. Their partnership, so carefully rehearsed, had been dismantled in full view. The evidence Caleb had compiled traveled faster than either of them could spin excuses. Financial trails, multiple identities, patterns of manipulation stretching across states. And the footage, cold, clear, undeniable. Interrogations followed. Legal teams were summoned. But the net was already closing. Lilith's charm dissolved under the pressure. Adrian's bravado collapsed into curses. Every attempt to regain footing met the same wall. Caleb's preparation. He did not attend the hearings. He did not respond to their messages. He let the justice system grind forward, gears oiled by facts. In the days that followed, Caleb returned to the hospital, performing surgeries, mentoring residents, filing charts. His colleagues saw the shift. There was less warmth in his voice, more steel in his eyes. But his hands, the tools that mattered most, remained steady. He wasn't a man broken. He was a man rebuilt. Outside the trauma center one evening, Vera Quinn waited with a file in hand. She handed it to him without a word. Inside were final notices, signed declarations, immigration holds confirmed. Harlan Devereux had ensured every angle was secure. Lilith and Adrian would face trial. Their freedom was no longer their own. Caleb thanked her, but his tone was distant. There were no celebrations.
No drinks. No toasts.
Just silence and forward motion. The mask had fallen. For all of them, but only one had stepped out from behind it stronger. The courtroom was cold in tone and structure. High ceilings, hard benches, and a silence sharpened by anticipation. Caleb Strickland sat between Vera Quinn and Jude Merrick, his expression unreadable. He hadn't come for vengeance or spectacle. He came for resolution. Lilith Marin and Adrian Vega sat across the aisle, dressed sharply but diminished in presence. Their confidence, once effortless, now hung limp beneath the weight of consequence. The judge entered. Conversations ended. The room exhaled as one. Evidence had already been presented in meticulous order. The financial records, travel logs, bank accounts hidden under false names, and most damning, the recordings. Footage of Lilith and Adrian speaking candidly, conspiratorially, their voices soaked in contempt. Their words hadn't needed interpretation. Caleb hadn't watched it again since submitting it. He didn't need to. Every sentence lived in his memory. Harlan Devereux stood and addressed the court with methodical precision. There were no theatrics, no raised voices, just facts. A marriage founded on deceit. An immigration system manipulated with intent. A man used as a shield. The defense offered rebuttals, most of them diluted versions of remorse. Lilith's attorney spoke of vulnerability. Adrian's attorney attempted to shift blame. But none of it could erase the trail they had left behind. The judge listened without expression. Then she delivered her ruling. The marriage was to be annulled. The charges of immigration fraud would proceed to the next phase. Deportation proceedings were approved. Bail was denied. Caleb didn't react. He sat still, his hands resting lightly on his knees. Lilith turned slightly in her chair, her eyes searching. Perhaps for sympathy. Perhaps for the man she had once fooled. But Caleb didn't meet her gaze. She was no longer a mystery. She was an answer. And he already knew it. As officers led them out, Adrian muttered something under his breath, barely audible. Lilith held her chin high, but her eyes were unfocused. For them, the fall had begun long before the verdict. This was just the sound of the ground arriving. Outside the courthouse, the air was thick with late summer heat. Reporters waited but kept their distance. Caleb walked past them without pause, flanked by Vera and Jude. They said little. There was nothing left to say. That evening, Caleb returned to the hospital. A multi-car collision had flooded the ER. He moved with quiet control, slipping into scrubs, sterilizing his hands, answering questions. The operating room didn't care about betrayal or legal victories. It only asked for precision. Hours passed in silence and focus. When the last suture was in place and the monitor steadied, Caleb allowed himself a breath. He left the ER just before sunrise. On his desk sat a note from one of the interns, a simple thank you for his guidance, written in shaky penmanship. He folded it carefully and placed it in his drawer. The victories that mattered weren't loud. They didn't require applause. They simply endured. A message arrived from Harlan later that morning. Appeals had been filed, but the chances of reversal were slim. The evidence held firm. The outcome, though not final, was solid. Caleb nodded once and closed the message. The paperwork was nearly done. The signatures were in ink. What remained was time, and time no longer scared him. In the days that followed, he resumed his schedule, pouring into his work, his patience, and the residents who looked to him for quiet direction. The story of Lilith and Adrian faded from whispers to silence. Redwood Hills had moved on. So had he. But the scars remained. Not as wounds, but as reminders. He had not lost himself. He had been stripped to the foundation. And still he stood. The silence was no longer weight. It was freedom. 6 months had passed since the courtroom doors had closed behind Lilith Marin and Adrian Vega. The dust hadn't settled so much as blown away, leaving only what mattered behind. In that time, Caleb Strickland had rebuilt what remained, not by replacing what was lost, but by embracing what was left. The trauma ward had become his refuge and his proving ground. He walked its corridors with quiet authority, his presence no longer fueled by urgency, but by intent. His colleagues noticed the change. Some whispered that he was colder. Others called it clarity. There was no bitterness in Caleb's stride, just precision. Updates from Harlan Devereux arrived in sparse, calculated intervals. Appeals were exhausted. Deportation was scheduled. Lilith, facing additional charges abroad, would not return. Adrian, caught in another scheme during processing, had been denied leniency. Their attempts to pivot, to frame themselves as victims, had collapsed under the weight of fact. Caleb read each update without reaction. He saved them in a folder he never opened again. Vera Quinn had taken on new cases, but still checked in from time to time. Jude Merrick had received a departmental promotion. They both understood without saying that Caleb didn't need celebration. He had already received what he came for. The end. He joined a local support group not as a victim, but as a mentor. There, in the quiet hum of community centers, he spoke to others who had faced betrayal. He never told the full story. He didn't need to. The weight in his voice said enough. It was there he met someone unexpected, a woman named Ria Salas. She didn't carry her pain like a badge. It lived in the corners of her smile, in the pauses between her words. They spoke often but slowly. Neither rushed the silence between conversations. In Ria, Caleb didn't find distraction. He found recognition, someone who understood what it meant to be torn open and rebuilt differently. They didn't talk about beginnings. They lived in the moment, one coffee, one walk, one conversation at a time. At the hospital, Caleb resumed training interns with renewed focus. One evening, a young resident asked him why he was so calm in the chaos. He paused before answering. "Because I've lived through worse," he said simply. No one questioned him after that. The memory of Lilith and Adrian no longer haunted him. Their faces had faded, their voices distant echoes. What remained was the lesson. That trust must be earned, not assumed. That silence can protect. That strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply endures. On the anniversary of the verdict, Caleb stood in his office, watching the city lights blink quietly in the distance. He didn't mark the day with anything ceremonial. He didn't reach out to anyone. Instead, he picked up a pen and signed off on a surgical residency application. A new chapter for someone else, and a closing note for himself. The world hadn't grown kinder, but he had grown stronger, and this time he would never wear a mask again.